And during the Matt Gaetz conversations, they basically told me that he's not putting up somebody kind of as a sacrificial lamb so that all of his other maybe more controversial or what people would think are less qualified nominees can get through. He's putting up the people that he wants to see in these positions because he believed that the American people gave him a mandate to tear down the systems in which he believes really kind of tortured him for the last 4 years. And so these are the people that he wants to see in these positions. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have backups. Of course, a lot of that conversation around Pete Hegseth this week was about him talking to folks like DeSantis and other potential Republicans that could come in if it was clear that Hegseth wouldn't be able to go through the process any further. So it's not saying that he's not talking to other people, but certainly he wants to see the people who he initially nominated in these roles, and he wants, and the folks around him want to see them at least make it to the confirmation process, really trying not to embolden the Senate to be able to declare, even before the process starts, that these folks are dead on arrival.
Yeah, and we heard from Speaker Mike Johnson defending Hegseth earlier. I want to play a clip of what he said.
Look, I like how he's approached it. We've all made mistakes in our lives, right? But we believe in redemption. And what Pete brings to the table is a love for the military, a great education background, a great experience set. I think he's well suited for the job, and he will shake up the status quo, which is why this pick is so important. That's what President Trump, that's the common denominator, people who will shake it up.
And Jasmine, it's just interesting watching that because Trump has not struggled as much with House members to kind of get them in line. Obviously, in a Senate confirmation process, the House doesn't really have any say at all. But seeing Mike Johnson out there speaking in favor of Pete Hegseth certainly, is good for Pete Hegseth. But it is interesting just how different it is when you go to the Senate. Some of those senators, again, on 6-year terms, not 2-year terms, are a little more willing to, or could be a little more willing to buck Trump in some way.
Yeah, and I think that this is a real test for Senate Republicans who I think really do want to give precedence and deference to the president-elect with his choices, but certainly there are going to be certain things that they are just unable to accept. And, maybe some of that those womanizing allegations aren't the biggest deal for multiple people, but certainly the drinking allegations I've heard from a number of folks on both sides of the aisle are a bigger deal, and they're waiting to see what that background check shows. I mean, when you think about Speaker Mike Johnson and other House Republicans coming to the defense of Pete Hegseth, he went over to that side of Capitol Hill and asked them to rally around him, to put pressure on these Senate Republicans who may want to be more independent or who may want to buck some of Trump's nominees, basically saying that I need you guys to support me. And so here you're seeing Mike Johnson speak out. You're probably going to be seeing more and more of them speak out over the next 2 weeks, really trying to ramp up the pressure on Senate Republicans, potentially maybe even those female Senate Republicans who do take issue with some of the allegations of sexual assault and other type of womanizing allegations that we've seen in the media over the last 5, 6, 7 days. And so I think you're going to see more of an effort to kind of circle around Pete Hegseth trying to defend him, certainly at least until that background check process comes up, Jessica. But of course, right, what we don't know is what we don't know, which is, are there more allegations waiting? And any more allegations makes it that much more difficult for him to stay in this confirmation process.
And I just want to ask you too, on a separate subject, President Biden reportedly considering announcing these preemptive pardons for people who may be targeted by the Trump administration for prosecution once he takes office. We know that Congressman Jim Clyburn has been a proponent of this. Senator-elect Adam Schiff, though, who might be one of those people considered for a pardon. Again, though, we need to underscore, none of these people have done anything illegal. There are no charges against them. But Schiff is reportedly urging the president not to do this, saying it would come off as, quote, defensive and unnecessary. What are you hearing about this?
Yeah, well, when I had heard the conversation kind of percolating in the White House, it hadn't actually reached, to my understanding, President Biden's ears. I think now that it is so far in the news, that potentially has changed. But it certainly was happening amongst more senior aides that were feeling nervous for folks who, again, they believe that didn't necessarily commit any crimes, but would potentially be on that retribution list, particularly after President-elect named Kash Patel as the FBI chief. So certainly those conversations were happening kind of in a vacuum, broadly starting in earnest in the last few weeks. And so it's going to be an open question of what happens, whether or not they're just floating it, see whether or not people like it, whether or not they're really serious about it happening. I think that conversation, Jessica, is happening at the same time where after Biden pardoned his son, Hunter Biden, there's real pressure on him from clemency groups, from lawmakers on the Hill, including Ayanna Pressley, who we spoke to for her story, as well as Hakeem Jeffries, for Biden to provide clemency to the just about 10,000 open petitions right now and for people under federal custody. And so those kind of conversations are happening at the same time, both, yes, preemptive pardoning and for Trump's retribution list, but also providing clemency for people who these folks in these advocacy groups really believe deserve it. Especially when you think about the fact that right now, President Biden has basically pardoned about the least amount of people compared to his predecessors, only about 25 people to this point in his administration.
All right, Jasmine Wright, as always, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And still ahead, after days of frigid temperatures and snow, things are about to change. The forecast is next. You're in the CNN Newsroom. It's been keeping things absolutely freezing in a lot of the country. Let's bring in Elisa Rafa. She's in the Weather Center with more. What are you tracking, Elisa?
It's 50 degrees in Nashville, 54 in St. Louis after highs widely in the 60s today. So really rebounding as that Arctic air gets kicked out. We've got temperatures 10, 15, even 20 degrees warmer than they were this time yesterday in some locations. And it's because that Arctic air that's kind of been in place since Thanksgiving is finally exiting, and it's letting some warmer air come in, and temperatures will start to go on the other side of average. We'll start to find highs continuing in the 50s and 60s across the eastern half of the country on Sunday, about 5 to 10 degrees above normal. In some places, 20 degrees above normal. Same thing going into Monday as well. We'll find these temperatures pretty warm, even up towards New York. Highs in the 50s, about 7 degrees above normal. Now, when you look at the forecast in New Orleans, you've got these temperatures in the 70s, warm and above average. But look at what happens. It comes with rain. What's happening is we're kicking out the cold air with a storm. And that storm is going to linger in the Gulf over the next couple of days and could cause a limited flood threat. We have multiple days of a flooding risk along the Gulf Coast. On Monday and Tuesday, we have a level 2 out of 5 slight risk there for parts of New Orleans, the Florida Panhandle. On Tuesday, it starts to stretch up towards Atlanta and then even getting up into the Carolinas. And it's because the system is kind of slow moving, and the way that it's positioned, the moisture in the Gulf of Mexico will just continue to feed into it and funnel it. So we'll continue to find some of this rain that could be heavy at times. We could find rainfall rates 2 inches per hour at times. So you'll have a lot of rain falling in a short amount of time, and some of these areas have saturated soil, so they can't really take that much more rain. So something that we'll need to watch overall, looking at some 3 to 5 inches of rain possible. Jessica?
All right, Elisa Rafa with the latest for us. Thanks so much. We do have breaking news out of Syria right now. A source telling CNN rebels appear to have entered the capital of Damascus as the Bashar al-Assad regime's defenses collapse. We're going to have much more on these stunning, quick-moving developments next. Newsroom, I'm Jessica Dean in New York, and we do have breaking news this hour out of Syria as all eyes are on Damascus. One resident telling CNN rebels appear to have entered the capital. Another tells CNN President Bashar al-Assad's military defense forces have collapsed. This as the rebels have captured 4 cities in a day. CNN's Nick Robertson and Oren Lieberman are joining us now with the latest. Let's go, Nick, first to you. I know you have new reporting on this. What have you been tracking?
Yeah, we know now that there are rebels within the city limits, within the capital, in suburbs that are less than 3 miles from the center of the capital. We know that through the day, rebels have been arriving from the south, from the east, and from the north. And we know that as the sort of sun was setting early evening there in Damascus, some of those groupings of rebels had got perhaps within 5 miles of the city center. What has clearly been happening through the hours of darkness, it's now 3 a.m. in Damascus. Those rebels have been moving in smaller elements, it appears, deeper inside of Damascus. Also, we know that there were reconnaissance elements of rebels in the capital now for over 24 hours. They were looking for the whereabouts of President Bashar al-Assad. They weren't able to find him. They don't know where the we can almost now say the former president of Syria. They don't know where he is. Has he left the capital? Is he in hiding there? Is he hiding out somewhere else in the country? Or has he in fact left the country? That is unknown at the moment. But what has become very clear through the day, and is evidenced by the rebels' relatively free and easy movement so far, at least into the capital, is that the military defenses there have been collapsing. We've seen more than 2,000 of Assad's army leave in their military vehicles, some of them big trucks towing heavy guns, leave into neighboring Iraq. I mean, this is almost unimaginable that Assad's army, an army that under him and his father has had an iron and bloody grip on Syria for 53 years, that they now would be fleeing to another country. This is unseen in recent history in Syria, and it really does point to what effectively is amounting to a military collapse of Assad's defenses of Damascus, a disappearance of the president, and the rebels now moving ever closer to the center of that city.
It is incredible. A military collapse and a disappearance of a president. Stay with us, Nick. Oren, I want to go to you. You're at the Reagan National Defense Forum out in California, where a number of U.S. officials have gathered. What have you been hearing from them out there?
Syria was, of course, a question that came up in multiple panels here. It came up in a panel I was moderating, as well as several of the others, and that's because of how fast everything is developing there. It was just earlier this morning that a number of U.S. officials told my colleagues at CNN that the Assad regime might collapse within a matter of days. And now, as we look at what's unfolding, as Nick Robertson tells us what he's hearing and what's happening on the ground in Damascus, it seems that a matter of days timeline may have been far too long. The U.S. has been watching this very closely, and the breathtaking speed at which this has unfolded, from its beginning in Aleppo until where we are now, where we're at the point where we're reporting there are rebel forces who have entered the capital of Damascus, which should have been a stronghold of Bashar al-Assad. Especially noteworthy is the fact that nobody seems to know where he is. The U.S. has been watching this, although the U.S. has also been determined not to get involved in this. This is the Assad regime, with all the horrors of that over the past several years, against a rebel group led by a U.S. designated terror organization. For the U.S., there is no good side to pick here, and so the U.S. watches from a distance. And yet it is of critical national security importance, not only for the wider region and the Middle East, but the U.S. has 900 forces in Syria. About that, yes, it's in a different part. It's in the eastern part of Syria. But what affects the entire country has the potential to affect the U.S. force posture there, and that's why the U.S. is watching this so closely. 2 missions there for the U.S., that is. The first is to protect its own forces, and the second is why they're there in the first place, which is the ongoing defeat of ISIS. And that is also another focus of the U.S. as they watch how all this plays out and what groups are able to gain power in this vacuum of space, that in what looks like it's going to be a vacuum. The U.S. wants to make sure that ISIS does not have the chance to create some sort of resurgence, and that remains a mission. Here is National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who spoke here at the Reagan National Defense Forum a short time ago.
Well, it's important to start by observing why this is happening, and it's really happening for 2 reasons. First, Assad has been brutal and repressive to his own people and totally intransigent in terms of actually trying to provide a better life or better future for the people of Syria. And so the people of Syria are fed up. Second, Assad's backers, Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, have all been weakened and distracted. And so he has not had the support from those 3 actors that he expected to be able to count on, and has been left basically naked. His forces are hollowed out.
The Biden administration's position, and we heard it from Sullivan here earlier today, as well as a number of others, is that the U.S. should not get involved in the fighting between the Assad regime and the rebels, or what's left of the Assad regime at this point. And this is an issue on which the Biden administration is in agreement with President-elect Donald Trump, who also said the U.S. should not get involved. From the U.S. perspective, there is no good side or a winner, and yet it is of critical importance to watch how all of this unfolds, and certainly to make sure the U.S. forces are protected as the U.S. keeps an eye on which way this could go, because it is going so quickly. Jessica.
Oren, thank you. I want to go back to Nick Robertson, who's in London. And Nick, if you can, just walk us through, with Assad gone, and again, we're waiting for confirmation, but let's say that his government does fall. Who takes over Syria? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think we're still in the very much in the military phase of this at the moment. And as we've seen in Homs today, the rebels arrive on the outskirts, they go in, they clear the streets of any government elements, they set people free from the jail there. And then, you know, after a period of time, they declare that they have Homs fully under their control. It appears as if this is a similar scenario that awaits Damascus. So I think there's still a period in the cities, at least, where the rebels are going to want to take control and exert authority. Then I think there's another question about what does happen to Assad and his sect, the Alawite sect. Their sort of traditional base is on the Mediterranean coast, in places like the port city of Tartus, in places like Latakia, a little bit further up the coastline from there. Does he go there? Does he sort of form a rump statelet there? That's unclear. But what is clear there is that Russia has strategic interests. The naval port that it uses on the Mediterranean, vitally important for President Putin, and the airbase at Latakia, also important for Putin as well. So Russia has interests there. So we're in the military phase still, and we haven't quite seen where Assad goes and what happens next with him. But what the political leadership is going to aim for there, we heard that from the HTS, the main rebel group, from their commander Jalani, speaking earlier this week with CNN's Jemana Karadzic, and speaking to her, and he told her that what they're going to want is for all those foreign forces to leave. That would be the Iranians, that would be the Russians, that would be the Turkish, and implicitly as well, one can understand he also means US forces. I've been speaking to another politician this evening. Now we're in this scenario whereby it seems much closer to the point of the military taking total control. And he's saying, look, what we're going to aim for here is we're going to aim for a situation where the military gets control in the cities, then it leaves the cities under the control of civilian police, that they will then try to sort of keep the government functions going by keeping regular government employees not associated with the regime in their jobs to keep the state functioning, pensions paid, all those sorts of things going. And then they would hope to form a sort of an interim government that should hold for about 6 to 9 months. It's not clear how that will happen and which faction will have how much of a say, because as we've seen, some of the factions have done better than others on the ground. And then after that, he says, that period of 6 to 9 months, then the aspiration would be to have free elections for the first time in over half a century for the people of Syria to actually vote for leaders that they want. Right now, I would say all of that is hugely aspirational and far from a certainty. But that's the aim. That's what we're hearing from politicians right now.
All right, Nick Robertson with the latest. Thank you so much. Stay with us. We'll come back to you and check in with you within the hour. I want to go now to Hagar Shamali, former director for Syria and Lebanon for the National Security Council. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you heard all of Nick and Oren's reporting there. First, I just want to get your thoughts on the fact that sources are telling CNN that rebels appear to have entered Damascus and Assad is nowhere to be found.
I mean, this is completely stunning. This certainly wasn't on my 2024 bingo card. And it's even hard for me to understand how these rebels could move so quickly, move so successfully. And I question whether they would be able to maintain control, because these rebels are somewhat of a ragtag group. This isn't a group of individuals that is very well trained in governing. They do control a small sliver, or up until this point had controlled a very small sliver of Syria in the northwest. But that's why when Nick talked about their aspirations, while it's nice to hear, I would agree with him that it's completely aspirational. It's shocking. All of this is shocking, because even when they took Aleppo, my analysis at that moment was, well, they were able to take Aleppo because it was a surprise offensive. But my experience when I was in the government handling Syria, and this is the case, by the way, not just for Assad, but for many dictators all over the world, is that they double down. They will bulldoze their own people and their own country if it means they can stay in power. And they will make friends with the thuggiest of thugs in order to do that. And we saw Assad do it. And not only did we see Assad do it, but it worked for him. He maintained power. Not only that, but countries started welcoming him back in the fold again. You saw the Arab League, for example, welcomes the Syrian government back into the Arab League last year. And you saw the United States turn a little bit of a blind eye to that. And so nothing to me indicates that Assad wouldn't want to pursue that again, except for the fact that his thugs are very weak right now. Hezbollah's been decapitated. Iran is on the defense. Russia's obviously distracted. But I wouldn't expect him to go so easily. That's the thing so this has been very surprising, stunning. I don't think any foreign policy expert could have seen this coming this year, regardless of how weak Assad's thugs are. But again, I just don't think it'll go down that easily.
And you mentioned Iran and Russia, of course, have helped Assad hold up his government. They are very much engaged in other conflicts right now. Help connect all of those dots for us, how it all connects together. And now we see what's happening, this video that we're watching right here.
Sure. So when the Syria civil war started in 2011 and Assad started cracking down with indiscriminate violence against his own people, this was during the Arab Spring. And when you had mass protests across the country, Iran stepped in pretty quickly to prop up Assad and to give them their playbook of how they used to crack down on protests. And then Hezbollah sent their top fighters to Syria. And so you're not going to have that right now, because not only do you have top fighters have been killed off, but you don't have really a leadership that's able to do that at the moment. But it was in 2014 that really when the tides turned in favor of Assad. And that's because Russia stepped in with manpower, with equipment, with airplanes, and they were really backing the Assad regime in fighting against his own people. And they claimed that it was in order to fight ISIS, but it was in large part to support Assad in fighting rebels and rebel strongholds. And they did that really with bombardments and mass bombardments. The Syrian government also, as we know, Assad himself has used chemical weapons against his own people. So he really brutally went against his own people. An estimated 500,000 people were killed. 500,000. Thousands, hundreds of thousands were detained and tortured. And over half of Syria's population of 20 million people, over half are displaced. I mean, this is what happened over the course of 10 years or so with this civil war. But a ceasefire was declared in 2020 that was brokered by Putin and Turkey. And since then, things have calmed down. Assad was controlling 70% of the country. The rebels controlled another small percent. And the Kurds, importantly, a U.S. ally, control the northeast. And you have, and Oren, I believe, said this as well, you have about 900 American troops there who are partnered with the Kurds, who are also there to protect them in the face of Turkey, which has been threatening them. And so Syria fractured ultimately. But since that ceasefire in 2020, Assad has done nothing to support people, to change the situation on the ground for them. And I was a believer, and many people were a believer, that as long as he was in power, Syria was always going to remain unstable and people were always going to be repressed by him. And so the rebels really here saw an opportunity. Now, the rebels, understanding these rebels is critical because they were designated as a U.S. terrorist. They were designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization in 2012, and that was because when I was in government at that time, they were viewed as Al Qaeda in Iraq, but the Syria branch. They were very closely tied to Al Qaeda. And as the years went on, they disavowed terrorism. They broke their ties with Al Qaeda. But that said, they're still designated because they still have had these shady connections and ties to different terrorist groups. And they also rule in the area that they control. They don't rule like some kind of democratic government. And so I don't want to in any way, shape, or form imply that this is a better group to have. Both are bad. Both Assad and this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, both are bad. The difference with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is that it is an Islamist militia. They govern with Islamic rule. They repress minorities. They clamp down on freedom of speech. They extort their own people. So this is not something to be excited about. I don't think Syria will be stable under them either if they can actually maintain control. But it's very concerning nonetheless. I only see further strife with what's unfolding.
Yeah. Wow. All right, Hagar Shamali, thank you for that context, for walking us through this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
We're going to have more of our breaking news coverage when we come back. A resident in the capital of Syria